how do you refer to someone as an expat versus an immigrant?
The idea of immigrant, it has a negative connotation.
How about a nomad?
Ooh,
I think that. I think that's more.
That's why I always use talent, yeah?
I would unify Europe. I would have Europe as one country.
It's not just the way how we perform work, but also the way that we organize work.
We need to somehow activate these voices that tell a positive story about migration being a success.
You know, we just travel with our skills everywhere and, you know, drop our bags and start working. Thank you. We have some questions coming in from our audience online. How does the vocabulary we use around global mobility and the future of work influence the narrative and the way we perceive those who embody a prospective workforce or talent? Versus, I guess this is interesting, how do you refer to someone as an expat versus an immigrant?
I mean, that's why I always use talent, yeah? Because like if you talk about migration, and some people instantly think about boats, you know, in the Mediterranean. And there's a lot of negative connotations. So like to really try to use that in a positive way, I think is a good way for me to go. Yeah, but maybe that's just how I think about it. I don't know what the others think.
Yeah.
I was just speaking to, I think it was you just before, where I experienced myself living in Canada for 5 years, a few years ago. I was referred to as the immigrant. So my fellow students were writing in my yearbook, to the immigrant. And as Damien also says, the idea of immigrant, it has a negative connotation. For people who are not used to working in immigration or being confronted to international profiles, such as I imagine a lot of people here, it does have a negative connotation. So I would personally choose the word expat because it does it makes me feel more positive in a way. It opens a lot of doors. I find it's international. Yeah. I would go for expat or talent. Yeah, that's a good word as well.
Yeah.
It's not an easy question.
Yeah, it's not. But I think it's something that's relevant because everyone talks about, you know, when you say expat and when you say immigrant or migrant, what is the picture that's immediately drawn in your mind? And how are you amenable to that profile that's already created in your mind, and how do you respond to that narrative? And how is the other person influenced by that? You know, what are the consequences of the person who is getting labeled, right? Especially when we talk about like workforce and when we talk about the labor market, how do companies view this? Do companies have biases, you think?
Absolutely, of course they do. No, I think just a few years back, I was writing a paper for my company on the topic of talent mobility and migration. And of course, you always share that internally with a few colleagues for input. And one of them said, "Ooh, well, can we please avoid the word migration because we don't want to be seen as, you know, managing migration or something. That's scary. But talent mobility was fine, you know. And so, of course, all companies have those sensitivities.
Yeah.
Words do matter. On the other hand, I've also, I mean, I agree with you. Expat has a much more positive ring to it. But I've also, at times, deliberately referred to myself as, no, I'm a migrant, just to break through that sort of stereotype of, okay, I'm white, middle-aged, and from a Western European country, therefore I am now an expat.
Yeah.
No, wait a second. Maybe actually I'm equally, you know, just as much a migrant as someone else.
Yeah. How about a nomad?
Ooh, I like
think
that.
I think that's more, you know, we just travel with our skills everywhere and, you know, drop our bags and start working. Yeah, I think we probably want to throw it up to the audience if you want.
Excuse me. First.
I think it's
probably
on. Yes.
It's on?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for the presentation and thank you for the interesting insights that we had so far. I was wondering, during the speak, it was mentioned, I picture a situation where companies are becoming national and people don't. And I'm Brazilian, I work in Germany, and most of my colleagues who are in the same situation, we are facing a funny situation, which is we, for personal reasons, want to live in one country, and we want to work sometimes in Germany or in another country that offers remotely work. So therefore, we are not allowed to be working in that country because we are from a third country, and we don't want to come back to our countries for any reason. So I would like to get to know more of your perspective, especially thinking that we are not talking just about work, we're talking about social security, medical aid, retirement, and those are things that we didn't so far thought regarding mobility, regarding remote work. So it would be nice to have your perspective on that. Thank you.
Anyone want to take it?
I'd love to answer that very interesting question, and it is really a problem, if I may call it, is that, like you said, pension, building up your rights in different countries. You have bilateral treaties that are talking about that, but then also there's countries with whom there are no bilateral treaties on Social Security, then I mean. Also the health insurance, you have global expat insurance that could cover a lot of the medical issues you would be dealing with. But this is something that is, I think, very far from our betcho still, to get a clear solution for these kinds of problems, because like you said, there are many implications. I get a lot of questions on a day-to-day where, as you say, people are working in Germany, have Brazilian nationality, but then they want to, so they live in Germany, but then they want to also, come and work on a project in Belgium, and then you have the employee status, then you have the self-employed status, and how does that work? Because then of course, you need a work permit to work, but you need a professional card as a self-employed person. And so then you're also working in two different countries. So you're talking about split payrolls maybe. And so it makes everything very complex. And from a Social Security point of view, you're always covered by one country. That is always the case. You cannot pay Social Security in two countries. From a pension build-up point of view, you could go 2 steps further into a third or a fourth pillar pension contribution system, let's say, which would be a private pot that you'd be making today for when you get older and no longer rely on the pension that you're and the rights that you're building up today. But it's a problem, and it's a problem that needs attention. But I think we're far away from an actual solution because of what I've said in a few minutes ago, was that we are European Union, but we are still individual countries trying to work together, and that's still something we need to evolve on. Yeah.
I think actually, I fully agree with you that of course some of the systems are just not fit for purpose for this day and age. On the other hand, I do want to sort of give a little reality check in the sense that I think many of the things that are in place right now are very understandable and have a very logical background and history. Of course, countries want to make sure that if you reside in their country, that you also pay taxes there to cover for your usage of the public services that are there, including walking over the pavements that are paid with public money, and you know what. When it's more about building up your own social protection, then of course it already becomes a bit more curious that you cannot do that in the way that you want. although many of those systems also rely on a sharing of a burden, and if you start shopping around, then that might also lead you to think, well, I might actually contribute in the country where I have to pay in the least. But is that really fair towards the larger system? And so, that just to underline what was already mentioned before, this is a very, very complex discussion that will very likely take years to resolve in the end.
But we are trying to actually start it. So I've basically already started a bit like lining out in a little paper for myself with my team, what are the different dimensions that we have been touching upon, which are, social security, taxation, wages, and all these different elements. And I'm considering bringing this in as at least a, group position within the European Parliament to kickstart this process, because we need to, and I do hear that this is like one of the biggest points also coming out of this pandemic for many, that employers and employees of how does that actually work if we somehow, take this assumption, I live where I work apart, and work and living conditions can be more flexible, more fluid also. And so, I think that could be a super interesting path to go down. So I would wish that we can do it faster, but it's true that since this is core state functions, it will be very difficult. And this is only European Union, and then you have to, for your case in Brazil, obviously, then, you have to even add another level of complexity to that.
Yeah, I just had one more follow-up item to that. Do we even consider, say, representation? Do we consider voting rights? Do we consider political representation?
Ooh.
That's something. I know I didn't mean to throw a
pet
curveball,
project
but I think it's important, because if we are looking at a world which is on the move, where am I represented? Like what?
I think.
Yes.
Sorry. I think it's just such a valid thing. I was campaigning for the Bundestagswahl in Germany. On the street, I was, talking to people in perfect German, like impeccable, without accent, that had been living in Germany for 8 years and didn't have the right to vote in the Bundestag elections, even though they were like paying taxes also for this whole time. That is like idiotic. And I'm currently also working on the European election law and on the right to stand and vote in regional elections, and so I'm trying to push that in this direction, but it's definitely like not working. Sadly I'm already like 15 minutes late for my last thing, which I had to go, because I don't know, some scheduling issues.
Thank you so
but I
much.
do wanted to. But just wanted to leave one last thought with you, because I think we cannot, talk about migration, not talk about Ukraine. And so I think one thing that we need to potentially consider as well now from more the job finding perspective is, okay, even if we here in this context, we don't talk about the asylum rights, let's think also about how to find jobs for the people who are coming, who then will have a status of some sort across the different countries where we are. And if that's just something that you can keep in your minds, I think in this kind of more business focused, talent segment, I think that would be absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Thank you so much for joining us, Damian. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Oh, here we go. With remote work being so prominent, do you think employees working remotely will be just as considered for promotions compared to employees working from the workplace? Very interesting. Also, do employers today have the infrastructure to have inclusive work environments for both types of employees, both remote and in office? Menno?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I think proximity bias, as it's called, it's definitely a thing. We've published a survey. We've done it now for 2 years in a row, and this summer we'll do the 3rd year, surveying both workers and managers or leaders of in white-collar jobs. And you see that managers, especially 2 years ago, of course, at the beginning of the crisis, they did not know how to do this. They didn't have the tools. They didn't know how to manage teams remotely per se. And I think because it's one thing to have the infrastructure in place. Everybody by now has Microsoft Teams or has Zoom or whatever. But then to actually be able to manage your team remotely, make sure that you feel like a team, that's a really different skill. And you need to be very conscious of that. I know that within our company, we've spent a lot of time educating leaders, giving them tools, doing trainings, and thinking about how do you make sure that everybody feels connected and feels engaged. Maybe one other comment about being inclusive, because inclusive means, yes, you want to try to have remote workers as well as in-office workers on an equal footing. But we also see that the opportunity to work remotely actually opens up opportunities for people who might before not have had the chance to actually work for this company.
Yeah.
People with care duties and who therefore have weird working hours, or people who have a physical disability who therefore have issues traveling to an office location, or all sorts of reasons why now more people might be able to join the workforce than before. So on the one hand, it offers an opportunity to pull more people in. On the other hand, there's also a risk of inequality because maybe not everybody is willing or able to do this remote working.
Yeah.
If you have 3 kids running around the house and you don't have a spare room to use as your remote office, how fair is it to judge you on the same norms as the person who is able to work perfectly quiet in their own home office? It's just a different situation. And so you might, as a company, you need to think about how do we judge our people, how do we value our people, and what kind of support can we give our people?
Yeah, and also the advantages of having people together in a room, right? We were discussing earlier, how do you manage, like, say, intercultural exchanges? How do you brainstorm better with your colleagues? How do you have, sometimes chit chat is the best way to get an idea. How do you still maintain that kind of, that friendly, warm, inviting environment where you don't really have to hate Mondays and hate your job? Maybe for some people it's a relief also from their home environment, right? To go to office, like you were saying earlier, that you've got an office space during the pandemic because you wanted that space. So how does that affect your clients or the companies and the employees you work with? How are they thinking about this?
Yeah, so I think the decision that I made in October 2020 to go for an office, a lot of people told me, "Are you sure? Is this really what you want?" I had been working from home for I think 8 years. With 2 children, and I managed pretty well. But at a certain point, after 8 years, I found myself to be very lonely, actually. Of course, I was seeing my friends and everybody, but I didn't really have the soundboard, although I had meetings and Teams calls, and I didn't have a soundboard. Also, being in the same space all the time. You're in your house, and we're fortunate to have an attic where I have my own office, but still it's the same 4 walls.
Yeah.
Also, the fact that I couldn't take the car or go by foot or by bike to a destination.
Yeah.
It was really
get some air in between.
Putting myself in a box. And so I decided to take this office, and so I feel a lot more professional to be able to to go to the office, to have my colleagues meet me, to invite clients over, but really to have a little bit of extra space, let's say, and to come back on how can a company try to continue this integration between employees and employers. I think a very good thing is a lot more team building activities.
Yeah.
I think that is definitely something that we need to scale up. I remember in my time when I was working with PwC, they had that all the time. They were working on their, team buildings, on events, and I think that is very, very important.
I couldn't agree more. I think it needs to be a really deliberate effort and not something that just happens. Maybe one other point, which is in that same survey that we did, what became very clear is that, and I tried to look up the number, but I couldn't find it so quickly, but a vast majority of people have a preference for not either working remotely or working in the office, but working hybridly. So 2 or 3 days office versus 2 or 3 days remote, because then you still have that connection to colleagues. Sure, you need to think about, okay, who is in the office at what time and how do you manage that, but that's something you can do. And it offers you that opportunity of running into someone at the coffee machine.
Yeah.
But it also offers you the opportunity of, okay, I'm going to cut my commute for today and I'm just going to sit in my pajamas behind my laptop and do, the home office relaxation kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
So most of the people really want that hybrid experience.
As a question about that as well, what about in terms of productivity? So, employees who are and employers who are experiencing this hybrid model, what is the general overarching themes, maybe statistics that come out of productivity within the workspace, given that maybe there is this hybrid model, especially in the last 2 years? Do you have some insight with regards to that?
Sure, right on time. So for the viewers online, the question was about productivity. And I think productivity, of course, is measuring the output of your work versus the hours that you put in, right? And I think both of those things have really shifted in the last 2 years. So first of all, it has raised a lot of questions about, first of all, what can and should employers actually monitor? We've heard some reports about keystroke monitoring, or can you look at the laptop of your employee to see when they are online? Do you even want to do that as employer? So that's one thing. The other thing is, and that is a number that I do have. 74% of the people that we surveyed said that they want to be measured more on output rather than on presence. And that to me really says a lot about, and that's a shift that a lot of companies, in theory, of course they were already doing that, but in practice not. And that goes back to the question before about proximity bias. And in the end, the one manager who knows, you're in the office right now, so I know you're a good employee.
Yeah.
Whereas maybe,
Yeah.
are they really producing something? Are they really, or are they keeping themselves busy?
Yeah, showing up kind of matters, but then where and when. Yeah, yeah. Do we have any more questions from the audience?
Well, I'm a digital nomad myself, and I've traveled for the past year around the globe, especially to the Caribbean and Ibiza. And for that, it was quite accessible. And I definitely agree with not agree necessarily. I would say that it's an interesting perspective to look at. Are people being productive, or are they just doing something? It's the difference of being busy and being productive. And that's what I noticed myself as a digital nomad, traveling around and working at several places. The hours differ of being productive and not necessarily having like an hourly set hours that you're gonna work. You're gonna be productive for the hours that you feel inspired to work. And how would you say, I am trying to inspire remote workers or wannabe remote workers on social media? How can we get that message? How can we pass on that message and get that productivity versus just doing and being busy out there and making it possible to work remote?
I mean, I think the first point to consider is that maybe it's more suitable for one job than for the other.
Yeah.
If you need to be in constant meetings, then it's useful to be more or less in the same time zone, because if you have to time and again say, oh, well, that's not a time that I am working, then that becomes an issue, of course. But if it's about you writing a long report, which you can do on your own, then who cares what hours of the day you do that in? About the how we get the message out there, it's a difficult one. I would say a lot of it is related to individual managers. I mean, it's an old saying, but people don't leave jobs. People leave bad managers, right? And I think that even more becomes more true even now. And so there's a lot of individual evangelizing to be done. But what bigger companies can do is set a framework, making sure that their managers, line managers know, I'm supposed to keep this in mind, or I'm supposed to give this kind of space to my employees or to my coworkers.
I think setting expectations,
Yeah.
managing expectations, that's the most important. Like we have car policies and we have cell phone policies. Maybe we'd have to work out like a digital nomad policy where the employer sets his rules, you know, and like really like a road book. I think that would be key in such a position, because myself, I think to be very flexible with the people I work with, but then I notice that my expectations are very high, and so I say, okay, well, my clients, they need to get an answer within 24 hours. But then in my discussion with people I work with, I'm like, yeah, but take all the flexibility you need because it's important, and I want them to take that flexibility because I have 100% trust. But then I catch myself thinking, oh, but that didn't leave. I didn't see that in my inbox, so where is it?
Yeah.
So I think the idea of managing expectations, not only towards your clients, but really towards your workforce, that would be key in moving it forward, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think also setting boundaries as employees and employers, right? Like, I think we're at a stage where companies have to come to terms with the fact that, you know, one person is in Ibiza or like another person is in Canada. And they have to put all of those things into consideration when they expect them to come, you know, to show up for a Zoom call. Although, you know, that is where the commitment lies, that is where the priority should be. But how do you how's the line towed between...
Well, it's also the other side of the story, indeed, because it's not only that people want to work whenever they can, but they also want to be able to take their rest whenever they can.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So should people have a right to disconnect?
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, personally, I would love if we can all just agree on this as adults, and if I can count on my coworkers to take the responsibility, as you say, and then I will give them that freedom. But I also know that in some, well, first of all, there's a cultural element. There's much more hierarchical cultures that simply don't work that way.
Yeah.
And there's also, again, some job roles just require a phone to be answered between certain hours.
Yeah,
if you have a customer hotline or whatever, then it's nice that you want to take your break, but sorry, the customer needs an answer.
Yeah.
And so I think, it's... and this is, by the way, one of the areas where also governments need to play a role by setting a good framework of, hey, how much can employers demand? How much can employees say no, or where, how, and how do you find the balance there? So on the one hand, the ideal is you're grown-ups and you have a grown-up discussion about it and you find a solution that works for all, but in the end, it does need a framework.
Yep. We have interesting sort of statements and things to think about. I don't know if you have other questions. If not, there we go.
I have a question, but I want to add something. What I wanted to add is, of course, you can work remotely, but and you can discuss that with your employer as an expat, for example. That is what we're talking about. But working remotely and staying, for example, in the Netherlands is fine. But then the question arises is that, okay, but what if I want to work from Ibiza? Can I just go to Ibiza with my Dutch residence card and work remotely from there? And then the employer needs to think of the rules that are linked to a specific residence permit. So you cannot just discuss it with your employer and say, hey, I'm going, but you also need to think of the immigration rules. And for example, in the Netherlands, the maximum is generally 6 months, But for highly skilled migrants, and this is specific, the highly skilled migrant residence card, it's 8 months. So I think it's very nice to talk about working remotely. I mean, that is freedom, right? But for expats, there are, of course, certain limits.
Yeah, I think a main thing to add there is if your insurance works there or not. You know, say you're there, you find yourself in a, you know, in a tricky situation. What happens then?
Exactly. Yeah. So that is also another aspect that plays a role. But I mean, you don't want to lose your residence permit, right? So you want to still have your permit and have the residence rights, but also the labor rights that are linked to this residence right. And that is not something very easy that I believe we can discuss when we're talking about working remotely, because expats always have that thing they have to think about.
Yeah.
There's a lot of hooks and a lot of tricky issues. I mean, even if you don't leave the country, there's already the issue. Okay, what happens if you sit behind your desk in your home office and your chair collapses and you, I don't know, you break a leg or something? Is that a work accident? Or and what does that mean for the health insurance? Does your employer have a responsibility therefore to make sure that you have a good home office setup? And what if you choose to not sit in your home office but to actually go to Starbucks and a chair collapses there? Is that then a work accident?
Yeah. That's employment law, right?
Yeah.
So that is again something different than immigration law. So there are a lot of aspects indeed that we have to think about. But at the end of the day, you know, it's immigration law, and you have
you're
this.
right. The two elements of employment and immigration law.
Yeah, it's very different.
Make it very complex.
It's, for example, I also always say. A lot of rules that apply for the non-expats, like the people who are born here, for example, and live here, have the nationality here. Sometimes other rules apply for them within employment law than for expats also.
Yeah.
So it's really tricky. I don't want to make it to sound very tricky, but sometimes you really have to think of those aspects as an expat. And that is also something that we give advice on, because we are immigration lawyers in the Netherlands, and we get a lot of these questions, and then we're really trying to answer it very specific that relates to the situation of the expat that is involved. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, is this on? So I think this has been an enlightening start. And there's so many topics, as you can see, to discuss.
Yes.
And I think it's a good time to have a quick break, but it's also a good place to think about some of the transitions here, because hopefully everyone can stick around, and also anybody who's out there in the binary can stick around, because we're going to be bridging into some topics that are definitely related and overlapping with what we discussed this morning. So such as, and maybe a question for Menno as well for the next session, but are the companies out there, let's say multinational companies, medium-sized companies, take for instance a Google, who has, you know, they're the closest you can think before the pandemic to building this work culture that has, you know, that's inviting for work, and it's an open source in that sense. But can you envision some companies maybe taking over spaces in the world and places in the world where perhaps there was this economic drain, perhaps there is an aging population. It's a beautiful medieval village that you've probably been to as a digital nomad, where you just want to go and hang in the piazza, and maybe you can do some coding in the piazza. So are companies thinking about, okay, there's so many stakeholders now. There's digital nomad villages. There's, you know, co-sharing spaces. We're in one now where remote working is possible, is turnkey. The immigration is another matter. But, you know, how are employees and employers maybe providing these incentives? So, you know, now it's not just commuting costs, but we'll pay for a co-sharing space, right? We'll pay for your global health insurance. And now we'll take over this village, I don't know, in the coast of Portugal, and send our employees there for team building and training for, you know, a month. Get to know the local restaurant. So, I mean, this will bridge into the next conversation that we have with some featured panelists who are doing some really, really exciting things on a grassroots level in Croatia, working with the Croatian government to pioneer the digital nomad visa. So that's an interesting area that we'll cover. We have other speakers who are right now inviting families with children who can, managers, executives of companies, to live and work abroad in this type of community space. So you didn't know your neighbor before, and now they're all invited to a space that's provided accommodations as well as education for children. So I think we'll be bridging into these topics to be continued and probably no end. So thanks for the discussion this morning so far, and let's keep it going.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.